All right, folks, we're going to get started. So thank you for joining us this evening for starting your 4-H year off on the right with the sequel. So for those of you who joined us in October, this will be a next step for you. So in October, we talked about selecting your 4-H project as well as starting your animal on feed. So tonight we will start talking about, or I guess I will be talking about, the transition to a growing and finishing. And then we have Delores here with us tonight to talk about the federal changes to the antimicrobial prescription drugs, or regarding antimicrobial prescription drugs. So my name is Lexi. I work with Forage Alberta, and I will be behind the scenes tonight. So if you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask them in the question and Q&A area, as well as there is a place where you can stick up your hand if you have a question, and we'll do our best to manage that as they come in. So with that, we will be starting with Barry. And I did introduce Barry on the last one, but just for those who might not have been there, Barry has been with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry for a number of years as a feed, oh, I'm sorry, Barry, you're a beef and forage specialist. And many of you will have seen him across the province talking about beef nutrition. So welcome, Barry.
Good evening. Glad to be here. We had a good turnout for the last initial session regarding starting calves on feed, what to consider. And tonight we'll take it into the second step. Most of the clubs have completed their weigh-ins, and the calves have probably been on the grain ration or the starter ration for roughly 2 weeks. And now we got to start thinking about how do we prepare to develop the rations and develop the calf so that they are actually ready to go for sale, or they're fully finished at the time of the show and sale. So topics to be covered tonight, we're going to be looking at how to change from a starter to a grower phase. When do these changes need to be made? What do we need to do? How long do we keep them in the grower phase? When we're adjusting the feeding programs, what are some of the pitfalls and concerns that we have? And what's the difference between feeding a replacement heifer and a steer project? They are two different animals and they need to be treated differently. Now I'm going to make a couple assumptions that your calves have settled into the pen, they're eating well, the manure looks normal like the patty that's on the screen there, and the animals are not sick. If any of these are not present with the animal that you have, you're going to need to make sure that they're healthy before you start changing them to a grower phase and increasing the grain and the concentrate portion of the ration. So the three phases that we have are the starter phase, which we finished, and now we're going into a grower phase, and we will be transitioning into a finishing phase as well. So what we need to do is, we've talked about...
Sorry, Barry.
Yeah.
It looks like it's your presenter view.
Yep.
Still, as we had earlier. But just so people can see, yeah, if you just click on that and just go the... There we go. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Yep, no problem. Just had it on the wrong screen. Okay, so with us talking about the starting ration and getting the calves on feed the last time, I'm going to get rid of this. Sorry, folks. Fat fingers on the computer. So basically what we're looking at is, if you're feeding a 750-pound calf right now, by day 14 on the starter phase, that animal should be consuming about 13 pounds of hay and about 5 pounds of grain or starter ration. Now what we're going to do, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to be increasing the grain in the ration. We need to take small steps or small increases in the amount of grain, 1 pound every second day. And when you see that golden thumbs up, that's what I call a rule of thumb, something that I try to keep to to prevent problems. Now, the slow increase in grain or the small steps needed to increase the grain will prevent acidosis or the sour stomach. So if we look at the picture of the manure, just below that, you can see that there's no texture on it. It doesn't look like the picture that was there previously. And if this is happening, your animal is not healthy. It is having real problems. And it may take up to 30 days for that manure to get back to normal, which indicates the rumen is back to normal as well. So the other thing that happens in some rations is people want to switch between hay and silage. Again, the changes have to be gradual. Off the start, when you're switching out the hay, take 25% of the hay out and replace it with silage. Keep the feeding rate constant for 2 or 3 days. The second step, increase the silage by up to 50% for 2 or 3 days, reducing the hay. And then the third step, you're going 75% silage, you're removing 75% of the hay. And then if it's all going good and everything looks good, after about 6 to 10 days, you can then replace all the hay with silage without any problems. Now, another rule of thumb that I use is when you're replacing hay, you need to feed 2.5 pounds of silage to replace 1 pound of hay. When you're switching between grains, there are some fellows that, or some farms that want to use a different type of grain. Maybe it's because of the cost or availability, but you always have more protein in wheat compared to barley, compared to oats, and corn having the least amount of protein available to the animal. As far as energy goes, your highest energy density is wheat and corn. They're both the same. Then barley's a little bit lower energy, and oats has the least amount, unless you're feeding the SO1, which is what they call the brown oat, or the other variety would be Nasser. Now, when you have these animals, you can see by the chart to the left that if you're feeding whole grains, it takes a lot. The digestion rate of the grain is a lot higher, or residual dry matter is a lot higher if you're feeding whole grains versus grains that have been processed either or they're put through a hammer mill or put through a roller. If you're using a commercial pelleted product, you're going to have the same type of digestion rates as the quartered barley or the quarter wheat. So that means that the animals will digest the feed faster, produce a little bit more acid, which can cause the digestive upsets. But on the other side, if you're feeding the whole grains, they cannot eat as much on a daily basis, and that's going to reduce your gains on those animals. So where do we want to start? Let's assume that we've had that 750-pound animal to start with, and it's gained well, and today's weight is 825 pounds. You've got 150 days until you hit the show and sale. You want the calf to be at 1,300 pounds by the time you're done. So the average daily gain required is 3.5 pounds as an average over that entire period of time to get that 525 pounds of gain. But we know that a smaller calf is not able to gain as fast as a larger calf. Therefore, we need to have the growing phase and the finishing phase where you're changing the rations. Now, the biggest question is, how do I feed, or when do I know when to feed the finisher ration, or how long can I leave him on the grower phase? You need a minimum of 100 days to get marbling into the carcass so that the meat is tasty and is good quality finished beef. In that finishing phase, you want to have 80 to 85% grain. It's up to you if you want to use Rumensin or Bovatec. Both of those are ionophores, which will improve your daily gain by 7-8%. you're expecting your animals to be gaining roughly 3.75 pounds a day, and your total gain would be 375 pounds during that period. Now, the question I get a lot of times is, well, how long does that finishing grower phase work, and how do I know when to switch? So let's do some calculations. If we're starting off with an animal at 825 pounds, and it gains 375 pounds in the finishing phase, we have a 1,200 pound animal with 50 days left in the feeding period. So if we're only expecting 2.25 pounds a day gain by 50 days, that'll give us 112 pounds of gain. So if we add the extra 125 to the 1,200, we are at 1,388 pounds, which is not enough. Yeah. So we don't get the total gain that we want. So we need to adjust how long this grower phase is and increase the time they are on the finishing phase. So we're close. We're within about 40 pounds of where we need to be to have that animal finished. And that last 40 pounds is important because it does make a difference on the quality of the meat with the marbling. And also, your animal looks a lot better in the ring when it is fleshed and looks and fully finished. So if we're 38 pounds short and we have a finishing phase where the animal is gaining 3.5 pounds a day, you need to add another 11 days in the finishing phase to get that animal to finish. So instead of 100 days, we're looking at 111 days as a finishing period. So using those numbers, we can see that we're not getting very much in the starter phase, which is good because you're just getting the animal to adjust to a grain ration and a hay ration instead of being out on pasture or with the cow. Grower phase, that's your transition phase, and that's the one that really makes a big difference on the success of what you're going to do. So if all these stages work properly and you get the total amount of gain that you need, everything's going to be good. So, there we are. That's better. So at the start of the grower phase, your forage content in the ration is roughly 65%. You'll have about 25 to 35% concentrate and grain and 65% forage. By the time you hit the start of the finishing phase, you need to have that grain portion of the ration up someplace in that 80 to 85% range, and you're only feeding 15% forage to keep that rumen functioning properly so that you don't run into problems. Now, how do we make that transition? We are working through with the rules that we've mentioned before, that every 1 pound of grain increase every second day to prevent your potential problems with digestive upsets. And where you're going to have the biggest problem is when you're feeding roughly 50% forage and 50% grain. Because what happens is you've got two different types of bacteria or microbes in the rumen that are trying to digest the feed that you're providing. The red guy there represents the fiber digesters in the stomach or the rumen, and the carbohydrates or starches. Just a second here. Sorry, folks, I'm with a cold and I'm trying to not sneeze at you. But anyway, the blue guy in the picture is the one that is digesting the grain portion of the ration. And when they're about 50-50, what they're both going is full out. They're trying their best to be the dominant type of bacteria in the rumen. And as you get through that 50-50 range and get into higher portions of grain, lower amounts of fiber or forage, the blue guy is going to win the battle. So if you're going to have a problem, this is when you're going to have it. So in order to get roughly 2 to 2.5 pounds a gain, or 2 to 2.25 pounds a gain, you're going to need to increase your grain ration up to about 60%, 60 to 65% of the total ration. So that'll probably take you maybe 2.5 weeks to make that transition. This is a duplicate slide. I apologize. So if your animal is 800 or 825 pounds at the start of the growing stage and only feeding 5 pounds of grain or commercial pellet, you've got 39 days at 2.25 pound a day in weight gain. That animal at the 875 pounds should be eating roughly about 20 pounds of dry feed in total. So what you're doing is you're going from the starter phase with 5 pounds of grain up to about 13 pounds of grain when you get your animal up to the proper feed stage in the growing system. So that increase will take you about 2 weeks. Now, a couple things that you have to be careful of when you're changing the rations, depending on the type of forage that you're feeding, if it's an alfalfa grass hay versus a grass hay versus a silage. Calcium levels in the grass hays and grains are fairly low. Phosphorus levels are fairly high in the grains. So in order to keep the animal functioning properly, you need 2 parts of calcium and 1 part phosphorus. It impacts the metabolism, and it also creates imbalance so that the animals aren't as efficient as they should. So once you get up to that higher grain levels, you can start. If you're not using a commercial product with a higher calcium content in the commercial pellet, and you're not feeding a mineral, or if you're feeding a mineral, it's a 1-to-1. What you're going to need to do is add about 1/4 cup of limestone per head per day to reduce the acidosis and rumen problems. And all you do is sprinkle it on top of the grain. You can do it once a day or twice a day to a total of 1/4 cup limestone per head per day. Now, I'm going to back up one because I'm missing some slides here. The other thing that comes into play is once you get above 10 pounds of grain a day to those animals, what you want to do is split that feeding to 2 feedings a day, half in the morning, half at night. If you can space it out for 12 hours, so if you're feeding at 7:30 in the morning, you need to feed at 7:30 at night. Now, the other thing that comes into play here is I know that people have hockey and soccer, or not soccer this time of year, but volleyball or basketball. If you're not going to be home to feed that animal at 7:30 at night, to make it constant, you're going to need to ask one of your sisters or brothers or your mom and dad to help out, because it's important to be consistent with what you're doing so that you are feeding at the same time and the same amount every day. If you're thinking that Christmas is coming up and you want to have these animals get a little bit of a treat and feed them 2 or 3 extra pounds of grain on Christmas morning as a present, please don't do that. You'll make your animal sick. So it has to be consistent, and it has to be at consistent amounts and consistent time of day, if at all possible. Now, your replacement heifers are a completely different package that you're feeding. What you have happening with the heifers is they enter puberty when they're about 65% of mature body weight. So if you expect your heifer to be 1,400 pounds in size when they're fully mature at 3 years of age, that means that they will start to cycle and develop traits at about 900 pounds. You have to feed them. You want them to gain. so that they are 85% mature body size at calving the first time, so that you don't have problems with the calf being, the heifer not being able to birth out properly, or the animal not being big enough to deliver that calf. The concern I have is if you push that animal hard and have them gain more than roughly 1.75 to 2 pounds a day, what occurs during puberty is the udder development tissue grows 4 times faster than any other piece of the body or any other tissue in the body. So if you overfeed energy during this phase, from the time they start puberty until they get into a breeding season, sorry folks, with the extra fat in the udder, that animal will not produce milk for the rest of her life, or will be a poor milker compared to an animal that doesn't grow quite as fast. Now, I know that is not what the judges are looking for in the ring. From the heifer shows I've been at, they want the animals to be as big as possible. The problem is, if you do that, there's either you're not going to be happy with the calf that she's raising, or in subsequent years she may not catch and be open, and she'll be going down the road, which you don't want to have happen. So if you're feeding to 1.5, 1.75, 2 pounds a day gain, the amount of grain that you need to get those animals growing at that rate is someplace between 3/4 to 1% of body weight. So if you've got a 900-pound animal, you're probably looking at about 7 pounds of grain a day as a maximum. If you feed only hay, that animal will only gain about 1.25 pounds a day. So try to do it a little bit differently. You may not win the biggest animal in the ring, but you're going to have an animal that will be productive for you in years to come. Time of day, make it all at the same time of day if possible. Split it into 2 feedings. The other thing is, for the people that are using a purchased ration, or if they're changing grain sources at home and you're grinding your own feed, take a gradual switch between feed batches. So let's say you've got about a week's left worth of grain or pellets in the commercial feed bag. Bring the new tote bag home. Start by switching in 25% of the new 25% of the grain ration or pellet ration into the mix for the first 2 or 3 days. 75% of the old bag. Then go to a 50-50 ratio, half from the new, half from the old. Then go up to 75% of the new bag and continue feeding 25% out of the old bag until it's gone, and then go ahead and go to 100% of the new ration. The reason for this is the quality of the grain can be different from bag to bag, and that could cause digestive upsets if you make that switch too fast. Here. So in order to watch what's happening, fill in the market beef record book, do the graphs, record what the growth rates are on page 10. You can either do it over a scale or a heart girth measurement with a tape, and keep an eye on it if you want. Is the feeding program actually doing what you want it to do? So in conclusion, watch the animal and watch the manure. If anything doesn't look normal, have someone else look at the steer or heifer. So if the ears are down, if the manure doesn't look good, if they don't want to come to the feed bung when you bring the grain, ask for somebody else to take a look at it. The other thing that you should realize, the way I've been talking, is if you make small changes, you'll have small problems. If you make big changes, you're going to have big problems. Weigh or measure the animal to monitor growth. And this leads into the next seminar that we'll be doing. And I'll be talking at that point in time about, okay, I've been feeding my calf for about 70 days. I can see by the chart on page 10 that my animal isn't growing as fast as I would like it to according to the growth curves that are needed. How do we make adjustments and how do we make changes to help get that animal to the proper weight by the time the show and sale come along? Okay, Lexi, that is all I've got for you today. Any questions from the crowd?
Okay, while people are doing that, we'll save our questions to the end, Barry. So Barry had mentioned the next webinar, the third step, and that, so if you wanted to mark that down while you're making notes of tonight's webinar, be on January 29th. So again, a Tuesday night at 7 p.m. and that's January 29th. So with that, we will start our second presenter of the evening. And tonight we have Dr. Delores Peters joining us. She is a veterinarian with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. She grew up on a farm between Red Deer and Calgary. She was a beef 4-H'er when she happened to be at that age, so through high school. And then today she works with disease control and management with Alberta Agriculture and Forestry. So welcome to Delores.
Let me know if you can't hear me, and also ask your questions during the presentation and I'll stop and explain what I'm talking about. I'm used to giving this just to grown-ups, and so if I've confused, I'd like you to ask the question at the beginning so you can understand the rest of the presentation. And are they seeing this or are they seeing the presenter? Okay. So the little bit of joke, the hospital staff, some of you may have gotten staph infections, not so fun. And we use antibiotics to treat them. What we're going to talk about today is the One Health Challenge. Why human medicine is changing how we do things in animals. We'll have a little bit of discussion about what words mean. What is antimicrobial resistance and why it's important? What changes are coming to beef production or to animal livestock production, and how you as animal owners will have to deal with that. So this is what we call the confusogram. This shows us all the ways that bacteria move from food animals to humans, between manure, between food, between spraying manure on land, between runoff into waters. And so to simplify that diagram, we talk about people and animals and the environment. And you can see that bacteria will move between all of these. And that happens, and that's why diseases spread between animals and people, and that's why you have to wash your hands after you've been playing in the dirt, because disease can spread from the dirt. And because bacteria can spread all those ways, antimicrobial resistance can spread those ways. What is antimicrobial resistance? Antimicrobial resistance is the ability of bacteria to resist or withstand the action of an antibiotic. And it's an ability that bacteria have had as long as they've been around. And it's one of their defense mechanisms, one of the ways they stay alive. Medically important antimicrobials are those antimicrobials that are important for human medicine. For the purposes of this talk, we're going to talk about antimicrobials, but we really mean drugs that treat bacteria. We're not worried about viruses or funguses. So here's a simple diagram of how antimicrobial resistance happens. In picture 1, you have a group of bacteria, and the purple ones are resistant to the drug we're using, and the blue ones are not. So we treat with an antibiotic, say penicillin or tetracycline or Draxin or Baytril, and our blue ones all die, but the purple ones are alive. And so The purple ones get to reproduce, and the blue ones don't very much. Maybe a few escape, maybe some of the purple ones change back to blue. And so in the end, you have a population of bacteria that are mostly purple and are resistant to the antibiotic of choice. And this has been around. Sir Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin, found resistance bacteria when he discovered penicillin. And he worried about the time when everybody would use penicillin improperly and underdose themselves and allow resistant bacteria to live. This is a TED Talk by Maren McKenna. She tells the story of her Uncle Joe, who was hurt. He was a firefighter in New York City, and he was in cleaning, and one of the big hoses dropped on his shoulder and caused an internal bruise. There was no cut. And he went home, he was fine, and he got sicker and sicker, and by the time he got to the hospital, they realized they could not treat him because antibiotics didn't exist then, and he died. And Ms. McKenna goes on to talk about the fact that resistance is developing to antibiotics so quickly that most manufacturing companies will not put any more energy or research into developing antibiotics. They become resistant so quickly that they don't get their investment out of it, and it's not worthwhile for a company to develop in more antibiotics. They just can't afford it. And so she talks about the fact that we might be entering a post-antibiotic era. This is work done for the United Kingdom about tackling drug resistance infections. And its main findings were that by 2050, which is well within all of our lifetimes, we expect 10 million people to die every year because they don't have antibiotics that are working anymore. And we expect the cost to the global output to be $100 trillion. That's cumulative between now and 2050. Those are big numbers. It's very scary if you're a human to think that that many people will die because we can no longer treat diseases. So the World Health Organization, which focuses on human medicine, has done several recommendations to prevent these serious consequences to human health treatments. And they want to use evidence-based recommendations and best practices. So they came up with several recommendations. And the overall one is right here: a reduction in the use of medically important antimicrobials in food-producing animals. And some of the ways they want to do that is they want to stop using antimicrobials for growth promotion. They want a complete restriction on using antimicrobials for the prevention of infectious diseases. They don't want to use critically important antimicrobials, for instance, Draxin or Baytril, for preventing the spread of a disease if you have an infection already. So if you have a pen of animals with foot rot, they don't want you to use the medically important antibiotics to prevent the other calves from getting it. And they also don't want the highest priority critically important antimicrobials ever used in food-producing animals. Health Canada has said, well, that's a bit drastic because we know it's important to be able to use antibiotics in food-producing animals. And we in the veterinary community support that. So these are some of the things that Health Canada has done. So a lot of them are in the background for producers or forage calf owners. They are increasing how antibiotics are imported. They're trying to increase the access to low-risk veterinary health products. These would be things like nutraceuticals, tonics, and other things that are designed to boost the immune system, but don't actually have any disease prevention or disease treatment claims. They're increasing how pharmaceutical ingredients, antibiotics are managed. And I'm going to go quickly to the ones that are important for you. As of December 1st, that's just the end of this week, there will be no more growth promotion claims. You cannot use antimicrobials just to promote growth. And all medically important antimicrobials will move to the prescription drug list. You'll see this blue sign contains antimicrobial on products that have antibiotics in it. That's just a reminder that we want you to be careful about using these drugs because they have antimicrobials, and it's important to preserve their use. And why are we doing this? Well, first of all, it was loss of efficacy. That's a big word, and it means that the antibiotics don't work anymore. When I was in 4-H, we used long-acting penicillin for most of our stuff, and we were just starting to use it at extra labeled doses. We were starting to double it. By the time I graduated from vet school, we'd use a whole 500 ml bottle on a bull or something, which was many times over the recommended use, but that's what it took to kill it. I'm sure most of you don't use penicillin as your first drug of choice anymore. And that's because it doesn't work for very many things. That's a loss of efficacy. You've all seen the ads from A&W and from people who don't believe in generally giving food animals antimicrobials. That's a market demand. And there is a risk that if everybody followed the WHO recommendations, that we would legally lose access in order to preserve all these medications for human use. And so we in the animal and livestock world have to demonstrate that we will use these drugs responsibly. I'm going to go back a bit. Lost the slide here. Yeah, okay, let me go. So what's a medically important antibiotic? The WHO has classified drugs into 4 categories. The 4th category is the class 4 antibiotics, which are not important for human medicine. These would be things like the ionophores, romancin, monensin, that are never used in human medicine. And so all your FEDI, your growth promotion products are still available. Class 1 are the ones that are most critically important to human medicine. These would include Baytril, and for those of you with 4-H beef calves, if you go to the Alberta Beef Producers website, they will give you a complete list of not only the scientific name of the drug, but all the common names. The reason those are really important is because in human medicine, there is no other choice. If the bug that a person has is resistant to category 1 antibiotics, there is no other option for treating that person as far as drugs. So those are really important, and we really want to preserve those category 1s for those crisis points when we need them. Category 2 drugs are also really important for human medicine, but they're not our drug of last resort. So if the category 2 drugs don't work, we can go to the category 1s. Category 3 are our routine use drugs that are also important for human meds. And to be honest, we'd love to be in a place where category 3 drugs are our primary use drugs for all infections, because it gives us 2 steps to back up if we need it. And those are the categories. All category 1, 2, and 3 drugs will become prescription. And so what does that mean? As of December 1st, you will need a veterinary prescription to obtain category 1, 2, and 3 antimicrobials. And once you get a prescription from a veterinarian, you can go to the same vet clinic, a different vet clinic, possibly a pharmacy. And if it's a medicated feed, you can go to a commercial feed mill to get that prescription filled. Many of you will have been used to going to your local farm supply store, perhaps a UFA or a PV Mark or your local independent, to get those products. They will no longer be available. What's December 1st? Saturday? Friday? Saturday. Stock up. For in-feed use, you will have to have a prescription signed by a veterinarian that will have to be given to the feed mill before they can sell you a feed with medication in it. You may be able to buy macro mixes that have antibiotics in them with a prescription, but you will not be able to buy, if you have an on-farm mixing system, you will not be able to buy the antibiotic. It will have to be pre-mixed into a macro mix or something like that. If they were able to floor stock, if UFA or PV Mark or independent was able to floor stock medicated feeds like calf starters or chick starters, the commercial feed mills will be able to floor stock them, but you still will need a prescription to buy them. What is veterinary oversight? Veterinary oversight means that the veterinarian takes responsibility for your use of antibiotics. And that means that the veterinarian, they have the education and experience to know if antibiotics are correct to use in this situation that your animal has. And they also then become legally responsible for the use of those antibiotics, which includes withdrawal times. And so veterinarians are professionals who are trained in health management and antimicrobial use, and they then have the authority to make sure that those antibiotics are used properly. Prescribing is another professional activity, and just as when you go to a human doctor and get a prescription, you then go to a pharmacy to get it filled. The pharmacist will review things like, is this the right medication for what the problem is? Are you the right patient? Have I got things mixed up? Am I giving the right person the right drugs? Do you know how to take this drug? And the same thing is for dispensing veterinary drugs, whether it's the feed mill, another veterinarian, or your prescribing veterinarian. Pharmacists are legally entitled to dispense veterinary products. They're not used to doing it, so it's going to take a little bit of time before we get that up and going. And all of those, both pharmacists and veterinarians, are professionally regulated, and we have requirements through our professional bodies that we do this properly with proper medical records. And if we're not doing it properly, we can be disciplined by our associations. And if we're found to be not doing things properly, not in compliance, we face fines. Education, we can lose our license to practice temporarily or permanently. So how do you work with a veterinarian? A veterinarian must have a valid veterinary client-patient relationship. In this case, the patient is the animal, the client is the animal owner, and the veterinarian is the veterinarian. With regard to a specific animal or group of animals, they need to have evidence on which to say there's a medical need for an antibiotic. They have to write this up and document it properly, and they have to follow up to make sure that they were used properly and that it was effective. So what is a veterinary client-patient relationship? It means the veterinarian knows the animal owner, knows the owner's operation, and understands what the producer understands about disease and about management, and can make an appropriate recommendation. So work together with your veterinarian before the crisis. You can create standard operating procedures or plans. So I'm going to use an example of a big feedlot. A big feedlot with staff who are used to handling animals may say that if you have a fever of this amount, if you have an increased respiration of this amount, and if the animal's not eating, that is likely a respiratory infection. And this, if it's so many days on feed, it's likely bacterial. You've given them this drug at this rate. And that is the standard operating procedure, and then the vet can write a prescription, and the feed mill can stock those antibiotics. I cannot promise you what your veterinarian will do, but if you make a plan with your veterinarian to say, these are the common things I see in my animals, then your veterinarian can say, in this case, this is what you do, here's a prescription. And you may be able to have that drug on hand, or you may be able to at least have the prescription on hand so that you can readily, quickly go and fill it when you need. Here's dispensing again. We've talked about the professional role of the pharmacist. And here are a couple of places where you can find more information about what drugs are available, what drugs will become prescription only, and examples of things like that, what feeds will be permitted, and more rules. So in summary, AMR is really complex. You saw the confusogram at the beginning. We do know that any use of antimicrobials will lead to antimicrobial resistance. We want to preserve the effectiveness of antimicrobials for people and for animals, and these regulatory changes will help us to do that. And we want professional oversight through prescribing and dispensing to demonstrate to the our human health partners and to the world that we are being responsible in how we use antibiotics in animals. And it moves us kind of parallel to how it works in humans. I'm going to stop now and we can have questions.
All right, thank you, Delores. Are there any questions that have come in at this time? I just need to rearrange my screen here for a second to see if we have any hands up. So with that, oh, here we are. I'm not seeing any questions, so I apologize if you have any questions that I'm just not seeing at the moment. Barry, did you have anything to add or that you think would work well with Delores' presentation from your standpoint on feeding animals?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head, no.
We do have a question, and I'll read it to you verbatim, Mr. Barry. I'll read it just so that you can hear it. I am feeding my heifer and steer in the same pen and feed bunk. Will that affect my result for the show? I'm going to separate them around halfway through the year. And I'm just wondering, will that be okay?
Yeah, how big, if the heifer is less than 65% of mature body weight, you can keep them in the same pen. That heifer can still gain the weight the same as the steer during the growing phase, but as soon as she gets close to puberty, you're going to need to separate them into different pens.
All right, thank you. We don't have any other questions, but perhaps some people are typing in their questions. Delores, is there anything off the top of your head that you can think to share with folks that maybe didn't cover in the session? I know from some of the talks that I've heard around this would be finding a vet and establishing that relationship. Do you have any tips for our 4-H members?
Well, we do know that there's lots of vets throughout all of Alberta. And so if you're not sure who to look for, if you go to the Alberta Veterinary Medical Association website, you can look for all the vets in your area, and you can actually screen your search by going to beef. People who do veterinarians who do cattle in your area, and you should get a list of vet clinics that you can go to.
All right. So again, I'm not seeing any questions come in, and as I say that, I do have one come in. We have a question that's for Delores about the prescriptions. Will they need to be prescribed on a one-time basis at the given rate, or is it an ongoing thing?
It really depends on your relationship with your veterinarian. It will depend a little bit on how many animals you have and on how long the veterinarian would expect that problem to persist. So we need to, as vet professionals, we need to ensure that we have the right amount of antibiotics for the size of animal, the number of animals, and the disease. So it will, to be honest, it depends on your veterinarian, depends on your situation. I know with the large operations, there'll be standing prescriptions for some operations, and these are the kinds of operations where the vet is usually there every couple of weeks anyway. So there's lots of oversight. I'll wait for a follow-up question on that one.
I think the biggest thing with these changes that are going to come into effect is establishing that relationship early on before it's 2 a.m. and you have an issue. I think I'm correct there. Please do.
It would be, it's my nightmare that some people are going to find out of this through a rec.
Sure. So I'm not seeing no, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. I got excited there because I thought there was one coming in. So I'll just maybe give it another quick minute. And I'll call on Barry if he has any final comments for tonight's presentation and maybe leading into the next one.
The only comment I have is anybody's having trouble feeding their steers or feeding their heifers, if they want to talk to me directly, you can call me at 310-3276 or 310-FARM. And I'm generally here most days between 8:15 and 4:30. The other way to get a hold of me if you have questions is to use my email address, and that is Barry, B-A-R-R-Y, .Yaremcio, Y as in Yankee, A-R-E-M-C-I-O, @gov.ab.ca.
All right. And Delores, did you have any final comments?
Get to know your vet, and I hope you all have a great growing year and actually don't need a vet.
Thank you. So thank you, Barry, and thank you, Delores, and thank you to all of our foragers that have joined us this evening. And we look forward to having you join us in January at our the final edition of Starting Your 4-H Year Off on the Right Hoof. So thank you very much and have a good evening.